Choita, Gale, and Carlitos. Choita had some decent experiences in mathematics, but really didn't start to love it until later, when it came time to learn more about applied mathematics. Gale had really bad experiences in mathematics, but later was transformed through mentorship and teachers and professors that they really liked. Carlitos has always loved mathematics, set out to do mathematics and followed that path. Choita and Carlitos both identified as creative people. Gale did not, describe having a very difficult and hostile relationship with creativity. So my study, I did 1.5 hour semi-structured one-on-one interviews. We started with some relationship building, general interview questions on mathematics. I gave them a math task called Eric the Sheep. I'll put that up in just a second. We discussed some student work on Eric the Sheep task after they completed the task, and then we discussed their work. After that, we engaged in some general questions on creativity and mathematical creativity. For my analysis, I went through kind of like, I call it a 5-stage, but really it was maybe like 10 stages. Started with open coding and analytic memoing. Then I moved into axial coding, which was used to examine the relationships among the codes, particularly how definitions of creativity interacted with evaluative judgments and affect responses. And then lastly, selective coding. I was used to identify central tensions that kind of cut across those cases, leading to my framework. My main coding categories were conceptions of mathematics and creativity, evaluations, so any thoughts and feelings, I was coding those under evaluations of their own work and others. What I call CITs, which are contradictions, tensions, and inconsistency. And then cross-cutting themes, so perceptions of values, figured worlds, sociocultural, and then the last was a framework construction. Okay, so this is the math task that I gave them, and then I gave them student work of this same task, and I'll give a second so that we can read through it if we want to. But Eric the sheep is at the end of the line, 50 sheep waiting to be shorn. But being an impatient sort of sheep, Eric sneaks up the line 2 places every time the shearer takes a sheep from the front to be shorn. It's kind of a tongue twister. So for example, while the first sheep is being shorn, Eric moves ahead so that there are 2 sheep behind him in line. If at some point it is possible for Eric to move only 1 place, he does that instead of moving 2 places. And so this is the task that I gave them. They did this task, and then I gave them student work of this same task. So this was student 1's work. I know this is very small on the screen, I apologize. This is student 1, this is student 2, and this is student 3. So I gave them some time to take a look at each of these students' work, and they kind of sat there with them, tried to make sense of them, tried to see what these students were trying to make of this problem. And then I asked my participants, are there any creative elements that you find in this student work? From there, after they tell me what they found and what they think, their thoughts and feelings on their problem solving and creative elements, I then asked them if they thought there were any creative elements in their own work. And I don't have those to show you, but, so that's what I asked them next. From there, I asked them what creativity means to them, how they would define it, some more probing questions from there, general questions about creativity, and then what mathematical creativity means to them and how they would define it. Lastly, I asked how they would evaluate creativity in student work. So I did ask this at the end, after going through definitions of creativity. So they answered how they would evaluate that in student work, and then I asked if that would be different than how they would evaluate it in their own work. Some general findings, so at a glance, all of them were very quick to assign creativity to the student work. They found creative elements in the student work very quickly. They're like, this is great, I love this is great. They're doing this, multiple methods, pulling in chits, doing naked sheep, all of these things, calling these creatives. When it came to evaluating themselves, Carlitos used some hedging language, and Choita and Gale were both very, very quick to dismiss their own work as creative. Choita was like, no, this was just plug and chug, I just counted, it was very pragmatic, wrote. Gale was saying like, oh no, I was just like, this was being cheaty, not rigorous, I was just trying to solve the problem. For Carlitos, creativity is situated, relationally afforded, and co-experienced. For Choita, it was innovation, necessity-driven, and this reimagination. For Gale, it was anything that was related to the arts. Innovation, and specifically fast. So being able to do any of these things, but quickly. So after some analysis, this is my clustered framework that I pulled from the data. So what I found was there was regular, consistent contradictions in tensions in how participants defined and recognized and evaluated creativity within these contexts. So cluster 1 is we have, each of these students had, or participants had these pretty broad, stable definitions of creativity and mathematical creativity. But it fell apart when it came time to evaluate, so it became conditional. Cluster 2 was this self-other asymmetry, so of evaluation standards. So again, that was what I just discussed of like very quick to give out creativity, but very dismissive when it came to their own. And then last, it was this internal engagement versus external recognition. And all of these clusters really centered around not being able to claim creativity for themselves. The way that I organized these findings is to kind of choose one participant per cluster to really kind of illustrate what was happening. For cluster 1, these broad definitions but conditional evaluation, I chose Choita. So the main sort of tension here is that the definitions alone do not determine evaluation. She consistently recognized features in student 3, and I'll go back really quickly just so that you can see student 3 again. So this was student 3. It was immediately drawn to student 3 from the formula, as well as like, this cute little drawing and this story that gave life to the problem. And so for Choita, that was the most creative. I asked if there was any differences between student 1 and student 2 for her, and she said, no, mine's like that one. So student 1 and student 2 and her own work met her definition of creativity. Her definition of creativity was re-representation and interpretation of a problem. So any form of being able to really express what's going on in your head. However, when it came time to actually evaluate it, it fell through, because all of a sudden, when probed, she brought in these disqualifications. It was rote. It was pragmatic, just solving the problem. And so this visible hesitation and her use of disqualifiers and her explicit acknowledgement of the contradiction kind of captures this tension between what creativity is defined to be and how creativity is operationalized during evaluation. So I do want to draw your attention to the very bottom quote here, because I'm going to come back to that idea in a little bit. But she says, I wouldn't call my work creative. It doesn't feel creative, because it didn't feel creative. For cluster 2, I chose Gale to illustrate this cluster 2. Gale could have been a case study in that they were the most explicit in their contradictions and naming this dissonance that was happening in real time. Very metacognitive and like out loud. So the same mathematical actions receive different judgments depending on who's doing them. So these judgments were framed through embarrassment, performance pressure, internalized expectations about what they believe they should be able to do. She has a quote that mentions, like, I'm a terrible mathematician if I can't figure this out. Revoke my degree. So she had a very visceral reaction about not, like, needing to solve this problem. But importantly, she was not unaware of this. They explicitly noticed the question in real time, asking why the same kinds of mathematical actions are considered creative for others but not for herself. So she was very quick, and when I challenged her on, maybe not challenged, but when I probed her on this, she was like, yeah, I don't know why I called that cheating for me when I called it creative for them. So in real time, she was kind of grappling with this tension. So this cluster 2 really kind of becomes a question about who is permitted to claim creativity. So this creative authority is extended outward, but inwardly withheld. So revealing how identity, emotion, self-evaluation shape these judgments in creativity. Cluster 3, I chose Carlitos to illustrate this cluster for internal versus external. And I really liked this quote that he said to illustrate this. I think there's a difference between if you want to be creative for you and if you want to be creative for other people. So Carlitos distinguishes being creative for oneself and being creative for others. This kind of highlights how that engagement is recognized and responded to. So internally, Carlitos describes creativity as this sense-making, interpretation, and idea-making. And this kind of creativity can be messy, explorative, and unfinished. And it can exist even if the work does not look nice or polished. Externally, however, creativity takes on a different form. So Carlitos repeatedly emphasizes recognition, permission, and classroom norms, which I think is an interesting thing to bring up because that's what we're looking at, right? We're looking at math education. So he brings up, like, have we been allowed to be creative in the classroom? How does it feel if somebody points something out that is creative to you? He also frames creativity as situationally afforded. So asking whether creativity is allowed in a given space, whether it feels safe to be wrong. These questions position creativity as something that depends on context and relationships. And the key tension here is that creative engagement can exist internally, but creative legitimacy depends on external recognition. So creativity becomes real for Carlitos through this interaction and response and social affirmation. So the main occurrence that was happening in this phase was that cut across all of these clusters was this contradiction and cognitive dissonance. So they demonstrated, all of them demonstrated moments of this cognitive dissonance when these different logics started battling each other. Creativity and math, they started tug-of-warring. So these contradictions were not abstract, they were moments in pausing and hedging and discomfort and self-correction. And in several cases, like explicitly naming the contradiction as it was happening. I interpret these moments as students that are actively negotiating disciplinary norms, identity expectations, emotional risk. And so this framing allowed me to move from describing what students said to examining what these tensions reveal about creativity in mathematics more broadly. Which leads me to the quote that really is the title of my work, which is, I wouldn't call my work creative, but I can see with what I said that doesn't make any sense, and it's contradicting. But it doesn't feel creative because it's very rote. But as I'm saying it, it's like, yeah, that is creative. So that's why it feels contradictory. I don't recognize my own work as creative, but I can see it in other people's. Okay. In this, we've, I think, experienced that in math, creativity for them is about legitimacy. So valuing creativity is not the same as claiming creativity, especially for yourself. participants did not lack creative ideas. In fact, their solutions were very much the same as the students' work. But they lacked permission, self-permission, to recognize those ideas as legitimate. And so this study suggests that the problem is that they have learned when and where and for whom it's safe to recognize this creativity. This leads me into phase 2. I know I'm running out of time. But phase 2 of my study was a blend of phenomenography and phenomenology. I took the same participants and I brought them all in for a 2-hour focus group. And I did what was called a resonance and response loop. So I took a couple of select quotes from their one-on-one meetings and I printed them out and I gave them each a sheet of paper with 2 quotes on them from one of the participants. They were then given time to read and reflect and annotate on these quotes. And the non-authors of those quotes were then given time to talk about their thoughts and feelings and interpretations on those quotes. The author of that quote was then able to respond to those and talk about what happened from there. And they were able to engage in some kind of dialogue and discourse about those quotes. And that study is called A Blind Spot to the Self, and it's illustrated in this bottom quote here. Even if you can't pinpoint a definition for creativity, it seems like to oneself, it is clearly not what I am doing. And it seems to be some sort of blind spot to the self. So that was phase 2. The way that I saw this happening, not linear like this, but it was this iterative game that they played with each other of recognizing that there's some form of invisibility to the self. They reframed their view of creativity in mathematics through dialogue with their peers. In doing so, they overcame disciplinary filters, so challenging the dominant narratives of mathematics. So, implications, future research. This was for a qualitative research course, so this was I needed very minimal literature review, so I hope to do a deeper dive into theory. But I think that this work is really nicely situated in compassionate with mathematics, dignity-affirming pedagogy, rightful presence, any of the critical theories. One of my participants had a very visceral reaction when talking to me about their written responses on this work. And so that feeling is inevitably harmful if we can't name it and we can't claim that creativity and accept these mindsets. Yeah, okay, so limitations. This is obviously a very small sample size. Single institution, single math task, ultra convenient sampling. So not super generalizable, but I think extremely relatable, and I hope to do more. I do have IRB, so hopefully we'll have a larger sample size forthcoming. Questions? Yes?
Did anything emerge, or do you have any speculations regarding where that blind spot came from? Did they say anything about it during or do you have any speculations?
Yes, I do, and I think if I can see my mouse, this was from the talk that I gave earlier, one down. You can't read it, but I can read it. When you look at someone else's work, you can't see the struggle behind it. When I look at mine, I know exactly how I felt, and I didn't feel good at the time. So there's this affect nature, I think, that is happening there. They are naming it as such. But I could speculate that there's deeply rooted sociocultural norms that are part of this, dominant narratives that are coming into play, as well as this affect. Yes.
Does that link, I don't mean to take too much time, but you mentioned earlier about the interpretation, I don't remember if it's the same student, of creative being fast.
Yeah.
Does that relate to this? That it shouldn't have been, in other words, painful, or as painful as I
Yeah,
remember it being,
definitely.
kind of thing.
Because Gail, the one that mentioned being fast, did take a longer time than she would have wanted. And so I think, and she asked if she could use a calculator and all of these things, and it was like, she's like, oh my God, like, take away my degree. Like, I'm a mathematician, I should be able to solve this counting problem. And so, it's like, yeah, it totally hurts. So yeah, there's definitely that internal identity, affect coming into play. Yes?
So what I heard is that if when they were evaluating themselves, they actually were evaluating their feelings instead of their work. But they're evaluating others' work when they're evaluating it because they do not have access to their feelings.
Exactly.
So I find it quite similar to the fact that most people use probable as easier to imagine instead of probable.
Yep. Yeah.
So they're actually doing emotional evaluation. So it's a bit with the words probably. It's like forget about your process. What you will see is probably evaluation.
Yeah, there is this battle between this internal process and this external product, like polished product that you're like battling in between.
A Quaker friend of mine gave me this saying about blind spots that you might find helpful.
Okay.
And he said, because we all have blind spots, we have to be seeing eye dogs for each other.
Agreed. Be your eyes, Goose.
If I understand correctly, these people that you interviewed are math education PhD students?
Correct.
And you are a math education PhD?
Correct.
Okay.
It's totally possible that I just missed this, but in the Eric the Sheep task, were they given an explicit calculation to do? Because I don't think I saw a question, solve this at the end.
Yes, I'm glad that you pointed that out. And what's interesting is that they didn't ask that. They just went straight into doing it.
This is very far out of my wheelhouse, but really interesting to me. I was curious, I also identify as an artist and a mathematician, and I think of creativity as a literal process of creating, which can take a long time, so I thought it was interesting that someone described it as being fast. And I also think of, especially as an artist or a sculptor particularly, it's like, there's a lot of experimentation and literal play with materials and how space and time work with each other. I think similarly that process of like experimentation and play, I also find maybe in a very different process, but
Sure.
like at its root. And I was curious with this task, as it's a single task, do you think the people that you, the three people that you work with, do you think they would have responded differently if they were working on like a long-term task where they had to deal with this kind of experimentation?
Yeah, that's definitely possible. One of the things that I really want to do with this, because this is kind of like a pilot version of what I wanted to do, is to look at all sorts of different artists, literature, music, painting, etc., as well as a bunch of different types of mathematicians in different fields, and look at the blank canvas problem for what that looks like for them, and look at that process. It's possible that it had to do with the fact that maybe it was a smaller task, so to speak. But it is interesting because most of them said something along the lines of, it's just playing, it's just trying, it's just doing, it's this and that, and it's this interpretation of what you think. But then when it came time to like, was yours creative, they were like, no.
So let's thank the speaker.